Welcome, everybody. I'm Andrew Rube, the Scott Mead family head coach of Harvard men's tennis here at the college. It's my honor today to welcome these two trailblazers in the media. Jill Abramson, currently the senior lecturer on journalism in the English department here at the college, and previously the executive editor of the New York Times. And also welcome to Cesar Conde, the new chairman of NBCUniversal News Group. We're just so grateful for your time, and I'm so excited to hear this discussion and listen to your stories. I also want to say a quick thank you to the Harvard Varsity Club for helping put this on and all the work they did to promote it. We have people listening from all over the world and all different parts of Harvard. And finally, I'm just going to pass the baton here to our moderator, my former teammate, Peter Lattman, who's also had a long career in journalism, from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times, and now a major role at the Atlantic and the Emerson Collective. So thank you, Peter, and thank you all the panelists, and take it away.
Thanks so much, Andrew. This is great. And hey, everyone, thanks so much for coming out this morning. I got to tell you, for me, I couldn't think of a better way to spend an hour than to talk to these two old friends. I've known Cesar Conde for 30 years, since 1991, when I was a senior on the tennis team, and he showed up as a freshman, every bit as polished as he is today. And as for Jill, we met in 2010 when I joined the New York Times as a Cub business reporter. And then, just a year later, Jill was named executive editor of the Times. And, for me, it was really the thrill of a lifetime to work at the Times and under Jill's leadership. So we have so much to discuss, but why don't we start with each of you giving us a thumbnail sketch of your career ascensions. You've both had amazing career paths, and I'd love you to take the viewers through how you've rose to the pinnacle of American media. Cesar, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, thank you, Peter. You look younger today than you did 30 years ago, man. So you gotta share your secret with everyone later on. Jill, it's great to share the time with you today, and a special thanks to Andrew, our former teammate as well. We're just so proud that he is leading this program, and just great leadership already. Look, I'm excited to be here and spend a little time with all of you. My career in a nutshell, I had such a fantastic experience at the college. And I'm probably one of those folks that it took me a little while to figure out what was my passion and my career trajectory. So, coming out of school, I was a history concentrator. I'd probably tried a few things before that. Coming out of school, I got the good advice. I went the investment banking analyst route for a couple of years. Great experience as far as learning work ethic and getting some actual tangible real life work skills. But at the same time, I knew I didn't want to do that forever. Went back to get my MBA at the Wharton School. And then coming out of that, I worked at a startup, which back then, now we know, but back then I didn't really identify it. It was the first .com wave. So this was back in '99. And that was a wonderful experience because it was a complete different side of the pendulum. I had worked at sort of a very structured environment in investment bank. This was a startup where you literally wore every single hat under the sun. And, experiencing that sort of highs and lows through that first .com boom and bust was, for a relatively young person, was great because you sort of got cross-trained in a lot of skills. I then had the opportunity to work in government. I did a program called the White House Fellows Program, and had the privilege of serving under then General Powell, who was then Secretary of State Powell. And it was during that time that I think I really started to think about and fall in love with media. I had gotten a little bit of a taste of it in sort of my .com experience, but really was under that time that I really understood the impact that media, if practiced responsibly, the incredible impact it could have on so many people. And so coming out of that experience, I joined at the time a company called Univision. It was the leading Spanish language media company. It gave me the opportunity to get back home to where I had grown up, which was in Miami. I spent 10 years at Univision, first 5 years in a bunch of different roles, the last 5 years as president of it. And then about 7, 8 years ago, I got a call from Brian Roberts, and who's the head of chairman of Comcast, and Steve Burke, who was then the CEO of NBCUniversal, and they were great and gave me the opportunity to join NBCUniversal and play on a little bit of a bigger field. And I've run a few different businesses for NBCUniversal since then. I ran our digital business, I ran all of our international business, and also ran our Telemundo business for NBCU. And then, as Andrew alluded to, in May of this past year, I got the opportunity to start in this new role as head of our NBCUniversal News Group. That includes all of our news assets like NBC News, MSNBC, CNBC, Telemundo News, and the like. And so, anyways, just a great privilege to be here, and hopefully we can have a fun discussion for everyone.
That's perfect, Cesar. I would just note 2 other biographical details. Your wonderful parents. You have a father who's originally from Peru and a mother who's originally from Cuba. And they're fantastic people. And you're also on the board of directors of Walmart and Pepsi, which, I've got to say, I've known you a long time, but when I hear that, my head explodes. I can't believe it. 2, massive companies, and so impressive. And we're all so proud of you. Now, Jill, I feel like you are someone, you're like, there's no one I love gossiping more with you. You are a hopeless news junkie, and I feel like you have like newsprint running through your veins. So I feel like you might have been like in 4th grade and decided you wanted to be the editor-in-chief of the New York Times. Is that true?
No, hardly. And as someone who's a stickler for the facts, Peter, I didn't first meet you at the New York Times. I met you at a reunion for the Harvard Independent, and we shared a taxi leaving. And what can I say? I owe the whole career to the Harvard Independent, and I'm being only half ironic. I did not grow up knowing I wanted to be a journalist. My parents had 2 home delivery subscriptions to the New York Times, one for my mom, one for Dad. And, I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, went to Harvard, and basically, the walking satire of, a liberal. And, I really, when I got through with Harvard, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I fell in love with the news at Harvard because the Watergate scandal, which, was better than any juicy gossip you and I, Peter, have ever exchanged. It was just such an unbelievable story and an unbelievable outcome that 2, relatively unknown journalists back in the day, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, could bring down the president of the United States through, their amazing investigative reporting in the Washington Post. But the idea that I could ever myself do investigative reporting seemed, really ridiculous. I had worked on the Harvard Independent. I was their weekly drama critic for the experimental shows that were performed at the Loeb X every weekend. And my only memory of those plays is that the actors were always screaming at the audience. All of the plays. That was what experimental theater involved back then. And so, I'd been reviewing plays and then reviewing movies, but hadn't really done much digging at all. And soon after I graduated, Cesar, I actually worked in the election unit of NBC News.
Oh, wow.
In the Stone Age during the 1980 election cycle, which was an amazing cycle because it was the election of Ronald Reagan. And I kind of fell in love with journalism doing that, but kind of realized that writing was my thing. I loved, the reporting I got to do in that job. And I went on to work. I worked at Time Magazine for a while. I worked for Steve Brill, who bought a number of and started many legal publications, which was a weird place to wind up, because the one thing I knew when I got out of Harvard was that I did not want to be a lawyer. But I ended up writing a lot about them, including a couple of books. And from Brill's, from being the editor of one of Brill's newspapers, I got hired by the Wall Street Journal in Washington. And, my specialty was covering money and politics, which was an increasingly juicy beat that I had more or less to myself, and, kind of taught myself how to be an investigative reporter and became one. And, the world of lobbyists and sort of sleazy political bagmen became my specialty. And, it was a time I was coming up in journalism where there were very few women managers. And in fact, the Times had been among several big publications that had been sued in a class action suit brought by women, sort of a precursor to the Title IX suits of later years. And every publication and newspaper was under pressure to hire and promote more women. And I was, one of the few women of my age who had run a newspaper. And so at the Journal, they came calling. And then when I went to the Times, I was reporting more than editing in Washington, but I got appointed to be the first woman ever to be the Washington bureau chief, which happened election day 2000. And I remember that morning, the executive editor called me in and said, "We don't know yet who the president will be, but we know who the next Washington bureau chief will be." And, offered me the job, and I was ecstatic. And of course, the punchline to that is, my first job was not knowing who the president was in 2000 and supervising that coverage. And in 2003, the new executive editor, Bill Keller, picked me to be managing editor, which I was for 8 years. And I love that job. I love being bureau chief, because both of those jobs were focused on the news and stories and working in the trenches with reporters to nail big scoops and that kind of thing. In 2011, a year, Peter and I were laughing about this on the phone, a year in which the Atlantic actually predicted the Times would go bankrupt because business was really, really tough. For most of the years I was managing editor and executive editor, I was appointed executive editor, which is the top job, and was again the first woman. And, listening to, Cesar's amazing career running things, I found that being executive editor was probably my least favorite job ever, because running the whole thing at a point where, we were switching from print to digital first, and especially because business problems became my sort of sole preoccupation, an area that I didn't feel I had a particular talent for. I kind of ended up crashing and burning in that job. And, since then have continued to write. I wrote a reported column for The Guardian, until I got really tired of writing about Donald Trump and how awful he is. And, I've been at Harvard for the past 7 years trying to, help and train and make better reporters and writers out of the next generation of people who will be the Cesars and Jills and Peters of, the profession in the future.
And we'll talk about your mentoring and some of the stars that you've launched from Harvard a little bit later. I will accept your correction. That is true. I also wrote for The Independent, and I have great memories of covering sports, since this is under the, how do you say that word, Jill? Aegis of the Harvard Varsity Club? Aegis? Yeah. I covered the Harvard women's lacrosse team down at Princeton, which won the NCAA championship in 1991. I had a crush on half the team. It was a great assignment. And then moments that matter in your life that you don't realize at the time. We shared a cab home from this Harvard Independent reunion. And I'll never forget, I was a brand new reporter. I had junked a career on Wall Street to become a reporter, and I was working at Forbes. And you told me, you said, I'll never forget this. You said, I'm an episodic reader of Forbes. And I thought that was such a great adjective. I think I had to look it up. So I don't really read it that often. So just send me your clips from time to time, and maybe, who knows? And anyway, here we are. So it's actually kind of moving talking about that a little bit. Okay, well, you mentioned an amazing election cycle, I think in 1980. Well, that amazing election cycle pales in comparison to our recent election cycle and what we've seen the past 4 years. So let's get right into it. And actually, Jill, I want to start with you and then go to Cesar. Give us your report card on the mainstream media's coverage of Trump over this past half decade or so.
Well, half decade is interesting because, of course, going back, everyone in the country, including me, got to know him from his starring role in The Apprentice. And I think that had a ton to do with his election as president in 2016. And Cesar, I'm sure you're aware that Jeff Zucker, who was, a big shot at NBC at the point The Apprentice was hatched, and then went on to be the #1 show for something like 20 seasons. Jeff Zucker, who's now the head of CNN, is now being blamed for the creation of the monster that became President Trump, which I'm free to say now because I'm not bound by, the outmoded rules of objectivity. And the grade I'd give it is mixed. I think that the press has never, gotten over covering Trump almost the way he was covered when he was star of The Apprentice, as the celebrity president and circus master with the spotlight on him all the time, and everybody obsessed with his every tweet and rally. And, for that, I'd give the press low marks throughout his presidency, and certainly during the 2016 election, when places like CNN would go live to his rally and just show an empty podium until he showed up. But, the audience loved watching him. And let's be real, the New York Times has loved the fact that readers, click on the stories about Trump like crazy. Trump has made the Times a fortune. And,
Yeah.
It's been a symbiotic relationship. And, from being sort of off kilter and sort of obsessed with Trump, I think that the press overcorrected and became so blatantly, I feel he deserved very tough coverage, but I think so much of the coverage was so blatantly opinionated, and that, the audience, and Cesar, you should really talk about this. I especially, cable TV, which of course I became glued to during the election like everyone else. The audience, I don't think, makes the same distinctions that we always do between who on like a cable news panel on CNN is the party Democratic analyst and who's the journalist. It just, what they say merges. And, I'm not sure that audiences discern between Rachel Maddow and, your correspondence on Lester Holt's program. And
Yeah.
so it's contributed to this lack of trust in the news media and the belief on the part of a huge majority of Americans, according to every recent survey, that we're partisan.
Yeah, no, it's a huge issue, and I want to get into the divide in this country in a little bit. Cesar, you were thrust into this job during a year where there weren't, one, but three generational stories, right? You had the pandemic, the reckoning over race in this country, and this election. But let's focus on the election. NBC News had a couple of really winning moments. Two that come to mind are, Savannah Guthrie's interview of Trump down in Miami, and the star turn of Kristen Welker as the moderator of the last presidential debate. I mean, really two shining moments, not just for NBC News, but I think in all of the media covering the campaign. When you took this job last summer, or whenever it was, how did you think about, oh my God, how am I going to do this? And talk about those successes. You're on mute.
Look, thank you, Peter. I would say a few things. One is, as you alluded to, it was a very unique moment, I think, for anyone to start a new role, particularly a new role in the world of journalism. We had a health crisis that triggered an economic crisis, and as you touched on, a third dynamic, right, which was the social injustice conversations that were rightfully occurring in all corners of our countries and in many companies and organizations around the states. All of that, I think, each of those topics, I think, standalone would have been very difficult for any news organization to cover. All three of them at the same time, I have to say, was complex for us and certainly for all of our colleagues. Put that all in the context of a backdrop of a very unique presidential election cycle. And so, as you can imagine, there was a lot of busy nights for all of our team members and colleagues in the space. But I think what it did was, at least for us, it reinforced, I think, the importance of journalism. I think especially at this moment in time in our country, the resilience, the professionalism, the bravery of many journalists. Not just at NBCUniversal, but across the industry, who were putting themselves in harm's way every single day so that they could report on those three different crises and the election. I take my hat off to them, and we're extraordinarily proud of what they did. So I take a tremendous amount of pride that I was given, that all of us were given the opportunity to work in this space at that moment in time. To your point, there was real highlights, and we take a lot of, we were very, very happy about that. I would say a few. I agree with you. I think the town halls that Savannah hosted with Trump, but Lester Holt also did a town hall with Biden the week before in Miami, and I thought they were both extraordinarily eloquent. I thought they were great examples of great journalism, where they were holding both candidates accountable for the topics that they had been talking about on the virtual election stump. But clearly one of the highlights, as you pointed to, was Kristen Welker. She's one of our White House correspondents, now chief White House correspondent, and one of the co-anchors of the Today Show on the weekend. Kristen, by the way, is also a graduate of the college, class of '98, I think. She's fantastic. And so Kristen had the incredible privilege of being selected to be the final moderator of the presidential debate cycle. And so that was in Nashville. And I think it's important to point that out because she had a very unique responsibility. And on about the biggest stage that exists, she delivered. One of the things I like to point out, though, about that is the preparation that went into that. It's what is it? The phrase, it takes a village. And Kristen did an extraordinary job. But I think the other piece that's important is how the team surrounded her and helped prepare her. So sometimes I pull back the sheet on it because I think it's so interesting, the process. That type of assignment takes weeks and weeks of preparation. So we took her off her typical beat for about 5 or 6 weeks. We assigned and surrounded her with a group of about 15 to 20 team members from the NBC news team, investigative folks, research individuals. And so each topic, each question was heavily researched. In fact, the last couple of weeks, which was a lot of fun for me to be part of the process and the preparation, we had mock debates. And so we had one of our team members be candidate Trump. We had one of our team members be candidate Biden. And the preparation was incredible. And so as I was watching, I remember the debate on Nashville, I thought I was having deja vu, right? Because the practicing of the follow-up questions, knowing where these candidates on the campaign trail, how they were answering some of these topics and questions is, I think, what allowed her to be so precise on that big stage. And having said that, as much preparation as went into, she delivered and then some on the biggest stage that occurred. And so, anyways, thanks for flagging it because it was a highlight for all of us. And I think it was, as you said, it was a highlight for journalism. It's the Christian and Savannah and Lester represent some of the best that are out there, and we hope we'll be able to have shining moments like that going forward.
Let's talk about the shifting attitudes toward the media in this country. Jill, we were talking yesterday in preparation for this conversation. It's not just NBC News that prepares. We prepare in advance for these types of conversations too, which is why this is going so smoothly. But in the New York Times boardroom,
would you like me to do something inappropriate right now?
I gave you that speech yesterday, Jill. But in the New York Times boardroom, it's actually fantastic. There are photographs on the walls of world leaders and presidents throughout the 20th century. There's JFK, there's Teddy Roosevelt, there's Eisenhower, and all the presidents inscribe something to the New York Times or to the Sulzberger family. And there's one from Richard Nixon, and it's many people's favorite portrait on the wall because what he wrote, and this was after Watergate, after the Pentagon Papers, so you could imagine how he felt about the media. But he wrote to the New York Times, some read it and like it, some read it and don't like it, but everybody reads it. With best wishes from Richard Nixon. That was 30 or 40 years ago, a much different environment than the one we've seen where the President of the United States is attacking not only the New York Times, but NBC News and many other media outlets with a daily drumbeat of sort of vile attacks on the press. What has that done for the state of media in this country? And have you ever imagined that we'd be in this situation? Let's start with Jill.
Yes, I could imagine that we'd be in this situation because, you mentioned Nixon and his vice president until he had to resign and was later indicted, Spiro Agnew, absolutely, prime Nixon to, be almost as anti-press in his day as Trump has been. Agnew labeled us the nattering nabobs of negativism. And Nixon, of course, had his enemies list on which several former Cesar NBC News correspondents appeared on that list. And, it's now considered a badge of honor to have been on the Nixon enemies list. But I'll just digress for a second to tell you an anecdote about the presidential sign portraits on the walls of the Times boardroom, which is, I was Washington bureau chief when George W. Bush was made president by the Supreme Court. And he had no love lost for the Times, both because he felt the coverage of his father had been too negative, and he just didn't care for us. It didn't help that in the first interview with him after he was declared president at his ranch, that one of our White House reporters, David Sanger, stepped on his dog Barney, and Barney squealed, and the new president-elect had to comfort Barney for the rest of the interview. But I was asked to get the signed, as Washington bureau chief, to make a request for the signed photograph of President George W. Bush. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited. And the publisher was like bugging me for it. It was something like almost a year after, and still we had no signed picture of President Bush. And finally, the White House called me and told me to expect the envelope to be arriving. And when it arrived, I opened it, and it was indeed a photograph of George W. Bush with what looked like just his RoboPen signature. Nothing personal at all, which I interpreted as like the total stiff arm. and then I will close by revealing that Donald Trump, before, years before he became president, I think it was in 2007, was invited by the publisher to a publisher's lunch, which the publisher of the Times has every so often with all kinds of important people, from Hillary Clinton to Condoleezza Rice to generals, corporate titans, and Trump being, still considered a big deal in real estate, and the city was still recovering from 2011. The publisher invited him to come to lunch. And these lunches are, very formal with waiters serving food. Donald Trump was so awed by being invited to the Times that he brought his son, Donald Trump Jr., who was then still in college, with him. And, he kept gazing around the room, and it was like he couldn't believe he was in the same room as Tom Friedman and Maureen Dowd. And he couldn't have been kind of humbler or more grateful. So, the rants about the failing New York Times, fell on deaf ears with me, because I watched how much that man cared about the Times. Not sure he stuck to Nixon's adage that he actually read it, but his friends read it, which
That's
was
right.
the most important thing. And so he was, completely, over concerned with how the New York Times viewed him, and desperately wanted its approval, which is why, he continues to talk, I believe, to Maggie Haberman. It was all a show. It was part of the show. But, to Cesar's point about it becoming a dangerous profession, at a certain point, I reviewed Katie Tur's book for the Times Book Review, and NBC had to hire protection for her at Trump rallies in 2016. Trump would point to the area where the press was sitting at his rallies. He continued to do that as president. And, you would be in fear that someone would either clobber you or do worse. So.
Yeah. Cesar, I want to take you in a slightly different direction, but it relates to this divide in our country. So I'm not going to get into the political divide with you, but I want to get into a divide in terms of how Americans consume their news. So you oversee, 3 different news properties. And there's this phrase out there where we don't have a Walter Cronkite space in this country anymore, to use the CBS newsman. But you know what I mean? There's no shared set of facts. And yet still, these sort of old school broadcasts like NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt still gets 5 to 10 million viewers a night. CNBC, which is your business news network, still has millions of viewers, and it's how people get their financial news. But meantime, I have 3 teenagers who will never watch NBC Nightly News, will never watch CNBC. And, kids these days are on Reddit and watching people like Dave Portnoy at Barstool Sports to get their financial news. And, they're on Snap or YouTube. So as the head of these news networks, how do you think about appealing to the next generation of news consumers while nourishing, people like my parents who still tune into the news?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Peter, and it is one of the fundamental sort of strategic opportunities / strategic challenges, right, that our industry has right now. I'd say maybe a couple of things about it. I mean, first is I think that the consumption changes and trends that have been occurring over the last few years accelerated during COVID. I think COVID did that for a lot of industries. We saw it across the board where there were certain trends, and the pandemic and the dynamic that we all lived, accelerated those trends. It certainly happened to us in the media space and in the news consumption arena. First thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is, to your point, there's a difference between how generations are consuming media in general, but particularly news. In our particular case at NBCUniversal, what we're trying to do is a few things. One is we have the good fortune that over time we have built these great leadership brands, as you alluded to, in what I would say the traditional linear TV space. And so we need to ensure that we can translate that linear brand leadership into what we would say is the omnichannel ecosystem. And what does that simply mean is we need to make sure that our brands are available for consumers wherever, however, and whatever device they want to consume on. And so, how are we starting to do that? We've made, big investments in the streaming space. And so, for example, last year we launched NBC News Now. It is our 24-hour streaming service of NBC News. It is, getting tens and millions of viewers right now. It's an incredible platform for us, and we see very, very different demographics there of people that are consuming news. So this is the interesting thing. It doesn't mean that people don't want to see premium quality journalistic content. In many cases, it's what are some of the devices and what are some of the places that they want to see it on. And so just along those lines, we're making investments to launch streaming services across some of our other brands and the like. Now, to refine the point a little bit, if the average TV viewer on the linear side is over the age of 60, the average viewer in streaming is not a 20-year-old, right? But it's a 35 or 40-year-old. And so that's great because we're already capturing an entire new generation on new consumption patterns. The real challenge is a little bit what you were alluded to, is the folks under the age of 35. And there's no easy solution there, because I think the proliferation of not only devices, but places where people can get some of this information on social media and the like is a real challenge. And I think that's where you're seeing a tremendous amount of focus from news organizations, is how can they tap into to that. And I think it's important because, as we all know, not all news is created equal. And these traditional news organizations, for better or for worse, they do have standards, they have processes, they have investigative professionals that go into this. And so in a world where the topic of misinformation and the topic of extremism is becoming more and more of a challenge, the reality, and I've heard someone use this line, right? A lie or an untruth can travel faster, right, than the truth. And so what happens if there is a topic that people don't know too much about, someone that wants to give misinformation can quickly move to fill that vacuum of understanding, while a news organization or other folks have to, by definition, go through a very rigorous process to make sure that whatever they're putting out is accurate and truthful. And so that lag in information, that lag, I should say, of time, combined with the new ways of distributing information now through social media, it multiplies and expands extraordinarily quickly. By the time you get some of that truth into the discussion, now you're trying to disprove something that people believe is a truth based on something that is misinformation. And so it is one of the real challenges of our industry, and I think everyone is spending time thinking through that.
Sorry about that. Another challenge is, appealing to a younger demographic. We live in a country where in 20 years, we're going to be a minority country. Cesar, one of your first big announcements in your new role was setting very ambitious goals for NBCUniversal News around diversity. And you made this a priority, if not the priority, of your work in the early months and years ahead. Tell us about your thinking there and how it's going so far. And then Jill, I'm going to want you to talk about the same issue, why there is so much lag in terms of gender and racial diversity in journalism. Cesar, why don't you go first?
Sure. Well, look, first, as a news organization, we believe that we have a unique responsibility to look like all of the communities that we're serving here in the States and around the world, both in front and behind the camera. And so, with that context in mind, we wanted to make sure that we put that priority, that value first and foremost. And so we announced, last summer, an initiative that we dubbed the 50% Challenge Initiative. And the aspiration is very simple, is we aspire that our newsrooms be 50% people of color and 50% women. And so a lot of people ask, how did you all get to that, right? And the simple answer is it's data. It's based on data. 2020 was an inflection year for our country. It was the first time where Americans under the age of 18 were 50+1% people of color. So no longer is this the future, this is the present. And so if you extrapolate that, which touches a little bit on your point, Peter, if you extrapolate that 20 years, in 20 years, America will be 50+% people of color. And so as a future focused organization, we did not want for change to happen to us. We wanted to proactively make that change. And so it's not only the right thing to do, more importantly, and I point this out to people, it's the right thing for business. If we look like the communities we're serving, we're going to be able to do a better job of serving those communities. And so we announced the 50% challenge in July. We're so happy, one, with the progress that we've made as an organization, but I think more importantly is that we've seen other organizations in the industry and beyond take on versions of these type of initiatives. And it's great to see. I think it's great for our industry. I think it's great for our country. Now, I tell this to people all the time. This is not a short-term thing. If one wants to create sustainable and systemic change, it does not happen overnight. And so when we announced our initiative, it's a 5-pillar plan. I won't go into the details. There's no silver bullet for this. There's everything from content investments to pipeline investments to partnership investments to metrics investment. We're holding ourselves and our teams accountable. In our industry, we reward, we judge our executives based on financial metrics and on ratings, right? And guess what? We get results based on that because that's what we're judged on. So starting next year, we're going to be adding diversity, equity, and inclusion as one of the strategic objectives for our teams. And so we hope over a period of time, we're going to be able to layer in long-term sustainable change in this arena.
Jill, you are a trailblazer as the first and the only female executive editor of the New York Times. I also just wanted to add, even though you weren't there for the Me Too reporting, that was really a piece of reporting that, in my view, had as much social impact as any.
And I launched Jodie Cantor.
Well, you took the words right out of my mouth.
On what was a more than 1 year long assignment on gender, which that led to. So I was thrilled to see that.
Yeah, and I was going to say you've mentored, and I was specifically going to name check Jodie Canner. I mean, I think she owes a lot of her success in her career to your making a big bet on her early on as a young talent. And just against that backdrop, talk a little bit about diversity in journalism, both gender and race, and how we need to do better.
Yeah, well, at the very top in the leadership positions, like the one that Cesar occupies, and just from listening to him, you can see he's making such good changes already at NBCUniversal. But in the running the show ranks, the executive editors, the managing editors, the people right below, it's still a white male dominated profession. It just is. And, white men tend to see themselves in other white men and like to hire and promote them, which is, you asked me the reasons for it. That's one reason. It's improving. I have a lot of hope, and it was very important to me, when I was managing editor and executive editor, to hire and promote, way more journalists of color. I think the masthead at the point I was gone was more than 50% women and journalists of color for the first time ever. But you have to really want to do it. You have to sound like Cesar sounds. You can tell he really wants to do it. And, look at corporate America. There are still scandalously few women CEOs and people of color in the executive suite. What gives me hope is, the students that I get to teach at Harvard. I mean, they are every ethnicity, religion, background. Some of them, I don't know how they identify gender-wise, and I wouldn't ask. But Harvard has done, a fantastic job diversifying. I mean, what the place looked like in the fall of 1972, when I was one of the only women, that we were the first women who were allowed to live in Harvard Yard. So what it looked like then and what looks like now, it's just unbelievable to me. And that's what'll change things. That's going to make the difference.
Just mention a couple of the young journalists that you've taught at Harvard and are now sort of launched into illustrious careers.
Okay. Nicholas Fandos, who is one of the main reporters covering Trump impeachment both times and every big story in Washington. He was in my writing class at Harvard. A wonderful woman who was managing editor of the Crimson when she was in my class is now a star reporter on education at the Washington Post. Molly Roberts, who's writing opinion columns at the Post, was my student. I mean, they're all over the place. There are a lot of digital news organizations and, Business Insider, lots of different places. I mean, I'm terrible. I mean, I use every contact I have to get, not all the kids who take my class want to be journalists. I should stress that. It's hardly a prerequisite. But the ones that do, I'm a hound. I'm a pest trying to get them hired places. So Cesar, get ready.
I heard you loud and clear.
Cesar, I'd love you to just touch on Latino media consumption in this country. You rose through the ranks at Univision and then Telemundo before getting your job at NBCUniversal News. This is 17% of the country, a growing percentage at that. What are some unique lessons about Latino news consumption and how it is different or similar from the United States at large, and what it informs you about your job, as you change into a broader coverage area?
Sure. As you mentioned, Peter, I know my time at Telemundo and Univision allowed me to sort of work across the entertainment, sports, and news business. Before this role, I ran news organizations for 12 years. Same thing as now, just in a different language. And what was great about my experience during that time is it allowed me to work with a demographic that today Hispanics now make up 17, 18% of the US population. They're generating 50% of population growth here in the United States. So that's only going to continue to grow off a pretty big base. What's interesting though about the Latino demographic here in the States, it skews very young versus the rest of the American population. And so I used to describe this consumer, this audience as Generation M for folks. They're millennial, they're multicultural, and they're mobile. And mobile being they're mobile from a consumption perspective. And so I mentioned that Generation M a sort of categorization because throughout all my time, it's almost like I got Miyagi, right? I wasn't realizing it, but when I was learning about what the future of America was going to look like, right, by doing my day job, because these are the trends that are sort of demographic trends that are going to continue to grow. And so, Latino from a news consumption perspective specifically, they over-index on the usage of social media and all digital devices. And so we had to get very good as to how do we distribute our content, in that case, entertainment, news, sports, to this demographic. And so I think that lesson has been great for me to try to apply to my current role. And I think the other piece is for many in the Hispanic community, particularly in Spanish language media, news is really a lifeline for many of these communities. They don't have the plethora of news options that exist in English. And so there was a very unique responsibility in that a big portion of our country was getting or seeing the world through our eyes. And so, giving that the proper time and care was important for us. And I think the last thing I'd mention is the editorial, not taste, but the editorial interests of the Latino community are slightly different. They have other areas that they were interested in. Clearly, some of the top issues on their minds are also like the rest of America, right? The economy, healthcare, jobs, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, there was a big appetite for international news. So news about maybe some native countries. And so when you would see our newscasts at Telemundo or at Univision, yes, we would start with, maybe something that's happening on Capitol Hill, but we would also maybe start a newscast with something that's happening in Mexico or Colombia or somewhere else around the world. And so I think that also gave me a sense for, the globalization that's occurring, and we're trying to bring some of that sensitivity to this role as well.
Jill, in the few minutes we have left, everyone talked about the Trump bump in media. So the massive amounts of attention that people paid to the cable and broadcast news networks, the subscriptions that flowed into the New York Times. You alluded to it before that Trump, arguably saved the New York Times with his election. But now with a new administration and the pandemic, hopefully ebbing, you probably are going to experience something like a Trump slump. The news won't be as interesting. We're not going to have to.
Are you kidding? Lady Gaga's dogs just got kidnapped yesterday, and that poor man, was shot and critically injured. Look,
Did that lead Lester Holt last night, Cesar? The Lady Gaga dog kidnapping? I'm not sure. But Jill, if you were running the New York Times and we're in a meeting, okay, what are we going to do now that Trump's out of office and this news cycle is going to get a lot less interesting? What would you say to your troops?
I'm just not, it will be less Trump dominated. I'm not at all convinced that it's going to be less interesting. I think when we see, President Biden's immigration proposals gel into legislation, that, politics is going to go wild again. That issue is such a lightning rod. And you know, there's always a story behind the story. You know, there are always great stories to cover. And I actually predict the Times will retain most of their subscribers. I think most of them have gotten kind of hooked on the product. I hope so. And I guess, you know, talking about being hooked, I was just thinking about the fact that it's a winter Friday, and, you know, normally I'd be heading to the Bright Hockey Center, you know, for a hockey game in the winter, and now I can't. And I wanted to give a shout out to Harvard Athletics and Varsity Athletics in particular, because they keep some of us like me sane, and without it, you know, Harvard hasn't been the same place. It just hasn't.
That's really nice of you, Jill. And I think we'll end with Cesar talking a little bit about Harvard sports and Harvard tennis. Not surprisingly, Cesar, a couple of the questions in the queue are from our teammates heckling us. Shocking. I won't name any names.
I'm completely blown away. I can't believe that.
You could probably imagine who they are, but just give us, you know, 90 seconds on your Harvard tennis career, what it meant to you, and, you know, how you think about sports and its impact on your life generally.
Look, the short version, Peter, is, you know, first I am filled, and I say this always, the opportunity that Harvard, and specifically Harvard tennis, gave me was the opportunity of a lifetime, and I'm always extremely grateful. You know, Dave Fish played such an important role in taking a risk on that kid from Miami, and Greg Russell and so many people had such an influence on us. You know, I hated it then, but those runs that Dave used to put us on at 6 a.m. in the winter, particularly when, you know, you hadn't grown up in snow, put a little bit of extra hair on one's chest. But let me tell you, that work ethic and that lesson of sacrifice, you know, sticks with me to this day. Two, I'd say the friendships that we forged, some of them witnessed here on the screen, and so many others. You know, I just can't say better things for it. And, you know, the fact that we got the opportunity to compete in an environment where, you know, we were also learning life lessons, you know, it doesn't get better than that. And so I'm incredibly grateful. And I'm just excited that more and more people are going to have that opportunity. I am glad, though, that I don't have to compete with that left-handed, you know, zinger that you used to send at us, Peter, all the time. Most people don't know you're a lefty, but my gosh, that was dangerous. And obviously, you know, having Andrew lead the charge, you know, having one of our own leading this program and filling Dave's big shoes, it makes us all so proud. So thanks for having me today, man.
Thanks, Cesar, and thanks, Jill. And Andrew, you really were a great teammate, and we are super proud of, you know, what you've done with the Harvard tennis program. And we're really grateful that you had us here this morning. So thanks. I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, geez. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Cesar. You know, Jill, we're going to adopt you now. You can come over not just to the Bright Center, but you can come to the Barron Tennis Center. You're part of our crew, and I can't wait we'll see you around campus when you know, things get back to normal. And you know, thank you, Cesar. It's just, you know, so great. He spoke to our team last year, you know, when the pandemic first started, and really gave them some, you know, just talked about his career experiences, and it was really, you know, moving for young people, like what the work Jill's doing now, to sort of mentor these people and give them some guidance as they're looking for what comes next. So thanks to everybody, and thank you, Peter. This is Peter's second round as a moderator here for some of our very successful webinars, and you've got the magic touch. So I don't know, you know, Cesar, I don't know if you need somebody on the screen.
I was gonna say, if his day job doesn't work out, I got some ideas.
Give my agent a call, Cesar, and we'll talk.
So good. Well, so good to see everybody. Thanks everybody for joining us from all over the Harvard community. So glad you can join us, and thanks again.